Thank you. It's good to be with you guys today, and my hope is just to kind of pass along what God has done in my own heart and what I've been privileged to be a part of in terms of God's work, and hopefully spur you on and wherever God might be leading you. And so it's a pleasure to be back to Beeson. And this campus, though, holds many memories for me because I went to Samford beginning in 1987. So I grew up in a Christian home. Faithful parents put the gospel before me, but I never personally thought I needed the gospel or I needed Christ. It was always those people. And I came to Samford because my parents made me. I didn't actually want to come to Samford at all, but my older brother was here, and he was a senior, and he was a strong believer, and they had a plan that my brother would influence me to Christ, and it actually worked. And so I came here not willingly, and they said, you can either go to Samford or you can stay home. And I said, I think I'll go to Samford. And but during that time, that was the time period God had for me and just drawing me to Himself. I remember waking up a number of mornings and seeing my brother at his desk in our room. I roomed with him that first year, praying, and that began to cause me to consider my own relationship with God and the fact that I didn't have one. And so I joined a fraternity, and one of the gentlemen in there just began to hang around me and inquire about my thoughts about Christ and my own relationship with God. And across the campus in the chapel, my first year is when I came to know the Lord there in 1987. And I don't know if you know this, but this place used to be a dorm where I lived for 4 years called Crawford Johnson. And it's amazing that it's a divinity school now. It needed to be cleansed from all that was happening during those years. But anyway, Samford, of course, holds a special place because of my faith. I was able to meet my wife here. And in many ways, the decisions, the influences that God brought to me here have set a trajectory to even where I am now. And so these are such foundational years. I think back to where you guys are and know that while you might not see it, God's at work bringing these influences and setting a path and trajectory that you might not be aware of now, but when you look back, you'll be able to see that clearly. So, as she said, I graduated from Beeson, and this is me and Dr. George. And if I'm not looking so happy or kind of a plastered smile, I was so sick on graduation day, but daggum, I was putting on that robe and walking across that stage, and I hope I didn't give a virus to Dean George that day. But we graduated here. Let's see, that was 97, and then shortly thereafter went to Australia. As she said, we were there serving for 13 years. One of the things I wanted to communicate was when I came to know the Lord, I was fortunate enough to have particularly one gentleman who just followed me up and helped me get going in the faith. You can call that discipleship, mentorship, but basically he committed to me to love me, to serve me, to help me grow, and we would meet most every week to talk about what it is to relate to God. How do you pray? How do you get in the Word? We would do scripture memory, all these things. He helped me learn how to express my faith, and as I look back on that gift that God gave me in this gentleman, there was a few things that stood out to me that he influenced me with that, as I said before, has kind of set the trajectory and things that I still feed off of today. The first thing that we talked about a lot is not about what's on my heart, but what is on God's heart. He has purchased me now. I am His, and so therefore daily I'm putting away my agenda in light of His. And sometimes those would sink, and other times they would not. So to know God's heart. And He just instilled that in me to know what God's on about, and that He's brought you into that great, great story now, and He's wanting to employ you to be His ambassador. And that was just a mindset that settled in on me. I remember us talking about Habakkuk 2:14, "For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea." And that big grand picture that God is working all things in His providence to bring glory to Himself, because it is right, and that's where people's end should be. And so I would put that before you as well in terms of your own thinking. I know that as you look ahead, you have to make plans, right? I mean, you have to kind of make decisions in terms of what you're going to do and where you're going to work. But I would say one of the things that will help you gain clarity the most as you look ahead is knowing the heart of God, and always bringing your own desires and plans in alignment with that, and even making the tough choices when something might be before you that is settled and steady, but you feel is not necessarily in line with where God's leading you into His plan. Again, to know God's heart is one of the things that this gentleman just impressed upon me, and I thank God for that. The other thing that He instilled in me is to know God's world. And this began that influence of looking beyond not only myself, but beyond my own context to other places in the world. And one of the things that we would do all the time is pray through Operation World, which hopefully you're familiar with. If not, go purchase a copy and begin to know about the world. And this was another influence that He brought to me, was just to know God's world. So let me ask you this. Who knows, in Operation World, it's a book that summarizes nations, every nation, in fact, through painstaking research, and then splits it up into days throughout the year where they highlight a nation, tell you what's happening, prayer points there. Who can tell me the area of the world that's being prayed for today? I'll give you my lunch if anyone can tell me that. It's the Pacific, which is nice because I served there for a long time. But he encouraged me to know the world, what is happening in the world, and not only look beyond myself, which was that first point, but to look at the needs of the world and to consider if God would have me there. And so that was a wonderful influence, a very uncomfortable influence at times for me to consider those things. And then he encouraged me to know God's work. And one of the things that he told me always was one of the things that I needed to always have going was a mission biography, that I needed to be reading a mission biography no matter what arena God would place me in all the time, because that would give me a real sense of God's work in the world. And in a very practical sense, like we can study mission theory and those helpful matters that give some foundation to thinking about missions, but there's nothing like reading how someone went about entering into a country, difficult circumstances, working out what it is to get the gospel to wherever they were. And so that as well was a major influence. I remember the first biography I read was Adoniram Judson, and a just great influence at that time of my life, 18, 19 years old, reading about this gentleman who picked up and went to Burma and all that happened there. And since then, I've tried to keep biography going. And just recently, just to pass on some of this influence, I finished up John Patton's biography. I'd read a short one earlier, but there's a much longer one, and I plowed through that. But John Patton talks about his home influence, and I relate that a lot to this gentleman's influence on me, as well as my parents, but more particularly this person. And he talked about in their home they had a closet, a little room that after every lunch meal, his father committed to going in there and praying for his family and the nations. And he writes about this influence in his biography. Listen closely at how powerful of influence that was. John Patton wrote, "Though everything else in religion were by some unthinkable catastrophe to be swept out of my memory or were blotted from my understanding, my soul would wander back to those early scenes and shut itself up once again in that sanctuary closet. And hearing still the echoes of the cries to God, would hurl back all doubt with the victorious appeal, he walked with God, why can't I? How much my father's prayers at this time impressed me, I can never explain, nor could any stranger understand when on his knees and all of us kneeling around him in family worship, he poured out his whole soul with tears for the conversion of the heathen world to the service of Jesus. And for every personal and domestic need, we all felt as if we were in the presence of the living Savior and learned to know and love Him as well as our divine friend." Man, a powerful influence there. And again, this setting, this campus, Beeson Divinity School, they all went up to help me kind of grow in these areas, to know God's heart, to know God's world, and to know God's work. So I would ask you, how do you feel like your awareness in these areas is going? Do you feel like you have a grasp on not only God's clear call in the Scriptures, but also what He's doing in the world and your engagement in that? Well, that was quite powerful and led us to consider going overseas. And I remember I was working at a large church here in Birmingham, kind of fat and happy with that while I was at Beeson, and an opportunity came up to consider pioneering a work in Brisbane, Australia. And so Brisbane is on the east coast of Australia. There's about 1.72 million people there. And I remember going to this initial meeting and thinking, you know, all this time I've wanted to go to hard places, and here's Australia. I don't know what to think about that. And you probably say the same, does Australia need missionaries? And I had many Aussies ask me that as well. Why are you here? The fact is, Australia is one of the more secular countries in the world. The gospel has been there a long time, but definitely lost. When I was there, the head of the Anglican Church didn't hold to the resurrection of Jesus. And so there was so much confusion concerning the gospel. Churches really become whether it be a social club or a political activist club, but the gospel had really been lost on the whole. And there's some great work being done there, no doubt, among the Sydney Anglicans and a number of other groups, but on the whole, there was great confusion about the gospel, and it was a time of repenetration of the gospel and clarity. And so we were called there to be able to do campus ministry, initially to university students. And here's our first prayer card. We were with Mission to the World, which is a Presbyterian Church in America crew. And if you see something fuzzy on my face, it's because I tried to grow a goatee during that time, but I'm just not man enough to do that. And I tried, and people would see me from longer than 10 feet and go, something's on your face. And finally, I shaved it. But this is how we went to Australia back in 1998. And so when we landed, one of the things we had to learn was that we were definitely in another culture. While it was Western, it was definitely different. And my experience was in the first 6 months, you realize, oh, how much is similar. So they have McDonald's, they have Burger King, they have KFC, and you notice all those similarities. But after 6 months, it hits you like a brick in the face that, whoa, I am in a different place. And the culture that we moved in, this was one of the church signs in our neighborhood. It said, "Heaven is such that all who have lived well of whatever religion have a place there, your new church." This was not that uncommon, a message. Now, this is quite bold, putting it out there. But again, this kind of highlights you to how much confusion there was, especially in terms of the purity of the gospel, as we know from the Word of God. And so our work was cut out for us. And so the remaining moments that I have, I just want to kind of walk you through some of the things that we learned and observed there, and maybe there'll be some translation to wherever you might be, and maybe it'll also be preparation for wherever you might go, and hopefully you're considering God's broader world in that whole thing. And so, number one, this is one thing I learned. Team is as important as task if all things are equal. So when you read mission biographies, many of those, if not most, are pioneering works. And initially they didn't have a team. But we're at the time period now where we're able to do that, to form teams, and we're actually seeing the wisdom of that. But this was one of the things I learned as I was there. This is our initial team who went to the university campuses there in Brisbane. And who you work with in many ways is just as important as what you do. And so much we consider the task, whatever that might be before you. But if you know mission statistics in particular, you know the reason that most come off the field is because of a team issue. It's not that the task is too hard, while at times it's incredibly challenging. Most of the time, it's some sort of team or relational issue. And so one of the things that we were impressed upon before, but I saw even more while being there, is team is just as important as task if all things are being equal. And so as we were there, I don't know how many times I gained incredible encouragement or wonderful redeeming admonishment from the team I was a part of, this team. And there was a real sense of trust, and there was a real sense of oneness in our task. But man, how important I saw while we were there, the importance of team. So I'm not sure what you're considering as you look ahead, but I would put that before you as a consideration. Not only the task that's before you, whatever that might be, but who's the team going to be surrounding me? And is there a shared ministry philosophy? But beyond that, is there a kind of a heart-to-heart engagement that's going to be there, that's going to really spur me on? In our mission training before we went with Mission to the World, they talked about this continuum of endurance and enjoyment on the field. And that there were times where you're simply just enduring. I mean, you're persevering. And then there's those times where life is as it should be, and enjoyment. And they talked about what are the ingredients that cause you to stay within the bounds of that continuum so you don't kind of fall off and return. And one of those big things was team. And so as I look back, I thank God for forming the team that I did, but I would put that before you as something to consider as you look ahead. Not only the task, what you're going to do, but who am I going to do it with? And is there a real sense there that we're together all in this? The second thing that I learned in Brisbane was this phrase we had for our first year, risk or rust. That was our campus kind of challenge and slogan that we had as a team together, because we didn't know what we were doing. We really didn't know the culture, and our learning curve was vertical. I mean, we like I said, even though it was a Western culture, it was very, very different from the American culture which we came from and how to relate. And so our theme for that first year was risk or rust, and that is we can hold back and just hope that something happens, or we can just get out there and risk whatever that means and trust God that He's going to some way work through our mistakes and establish us with students and give us over time a real hearing for the gospel. So what did that look like? Well, we had different, they had different colleges, what they call colleges on campus. They're dorms, basically. And so we each picked a college. And we said, okay, I'm going to target a college. This was the one I picked. It's called Cromwell College. And we were like, well, what's our strategy? This was the whole of our strategy. Show up. Just show up and see what happens. We had no other great strategy than that. And so I remember one of the first evenings I drove up There's a parking lot out this way, if you can imagine. I drove up and I sat in my car. At that time, I was 30 years old and scared to death. Now, in this college, there was, 18, 19, 20-year-olds, and you think, why would a 30-year-old be kind of scared to get out of the car? And I remember this internal conversation I was having to get out of the car. And so at first it was the glory of God. David, God's called you here, and you need to open that door and just trust Him and try to begin engaging some of these students. Well, that didn't work. And so then I went to lesser forms of motivation, like, David, you've raised support for a year and a half, and a lot of people are giving you money to get out of that car, so get out of the car. And then that didn't work, and so the final one was, what are you going to tell your wife when you get home that you sat in the car in front of the dorm that you're supposed to be, targeting? I was like, okay, that's going to work. So, I get out. And I remember I thought, okay, I'll just go eat. It's a mealtime, and sometimes mealtimes are more relaxed and things like that, and I'll just risk that. Rusting would have been just sitting in the car. I had to get out and risk, right? And so I remember getting my tray and going out in the lunchroom. And of course, I don't know anybody, and I see this group of guys. And I just like, I'm just going to go sit down with them and introduce myself. And so I went and sat down with them. And at first they were kind of silent and wondering what this guy was there. But I just reached out and said, hey, I'm David. I'm here just to meet guys and to learn about Cromwell College. And I'm an American. I'd love to learn about your culture. And through many missteps and many rejections, I began to kind of gain a place at Cromwell College over many months. But risk or rust was something that if we didn't push one another in that, then I don't know that we would have seen God work in our own hearts, nor in the colleges that we targeted, if we didn't just say, I'm getting out of this car. I'm going to sit down with this group of guys and just trust God for whatever might come here. And it was the joy of my life to be able to see how God used those feeble efforts. Another part of our risk or rust was making observations of the culture. And I can't tell you how important this was. Instead of going in and thinking we had it figured out, we wanted to go in with observations. And so I was the campus director of that team that I showed you before at the time. And one of my requirements every week at staff meeting was we each had to bring 10 observations of the culture. It could be dress. It could be ways people talked. It could be the meaning of words. And every staff meeting for that first semester, we would bring 10 observations. And I can't tell you how much that helped us. I brought an Aussie in during that time, too, to help filter our own interpretations. But we observed everything from dress to manner of speaking to leadership and all these things. And we just had to adjust as we went. And so I went, I arrived in Brisbane much like this, and that wasn't working. And so I had to change the way I dressed. I had to adjust the way that I spoke. I didn't want to put on the Aussie accent because that's not genuine, but I wanted to use words that they would use. So instead of banana, I'd say banana. Instead of tomato, I'd say tomato. I got on board with everything that was Brisbane. I loved the rugby. I learned cricket. All these things just to make expressions to those I was trying to reach in order for them to see, man, I'm learning to value this culture. I want to learn this culture. And I want to, in the end, bring Christ to bear, whatever that might look like. And so that was another way we were trying to just incorporate there into Brisbane. And so when we returned to the U.S. After 13 years, just 5 years ago, I must admit I had a lot of missionary righteousness in me, returning to the South particularly. I remember checking out at the Walgreens there in Helena, and as I left, the lady said, "God bless you." And you don't hear that at all in Australia, and my assumption from this lady was just something you say, and for 6 months I was so crusty here back in the U.S., and just this self-righteousness in me that I'd been over there serving on the what could be considered some of the more front lines of things, and I'm back here in the South, and one of the things God really put on me was this: David, I need you to re-enter this culture like you entered Australia. I need you to come back here, and I need you to make the observations here. I need you to relearn your home culture again, and I need you to champion it like you champion there. I need you to let go of the righteousness that you've built some of your identity on of being a missionary. I need you to let that go, and I need you to re-enter. And so after a number of months of God really working on me through many means, I began to do the same thing. I began to make observations once again of our culture there in Helena, what people enjoyed. And I began to speak like a Southerner again, not inauthentically, but I never said y'all in Australia. That's not what they say. I didn't say it. I got back here, I thought, I'm not saying y'all anymore. It's just, again, just this ugly kind of prideful self-righteousness. But God was like, say y'all, David. Get in the culture again. And so I'm relearning that now. But again, the risk or rusk should be applied anywhere you go, whatever setting. If you're going into an established work or you're pioneering a new work, one of the most important things is that you risk, in appropriate ways, of course, with counsel and other things, but that you risk, you take the initiative. You observe the culture and you adjust who you are and all those things, and you'll find that through that, people will regard how you're going about the relationship with them, whatever culture you're in, and that will gain you a hearing from the gospel. Does that make sense? Okay. This was another thing that I observed and learned while we were there. Choose deep instead of wide if you have to make a choice, and grow leadership from within. And so one of the charges that we had, of course, was to seek to put the gospel before students and that sort of thing, but also to ask God and to work to raise up laborers there from the Aussie people to lead the work. So no matter how Aussie I became, I was not an Aussie. And I believe on the whole that Aussies can reach Aussies better than an American can reach an Aussie. I think that's true on the whole. And so what we wanted to do was be more deep than wide. That is, if I have the capacity of one person, and as you do, I can't do what two or three people, I can only do what one person can do and what God's called me to do. So I had to understand that, and that first year we had a few students come to know the Lord. Well, that's exciting. And I wanted to see that more and more, but it's like, okay, I've got to establish these men who really have no background whatsoever, and that takes a lot of effort and time, or I can keep going wide and just try to feed them as I go. And so we made the choice as a team to go more deep than wide, and within that to try to grow leadership from within. So the more deep than wide, I would say this. What we aim for is this. We wanted mature and equipped believers as opposed to knowledgeable and committed. I think what fills the church mostly now is knowledgeable and committed people. They know and they're committed. But don't we, as pastors, as leaders, as those who are influencing and encouraging others, don't we want more than knowledgeable and committed? We aimed for mature and equipped, and I do think there's a difference, and I have a whole nother, talk on that, but that was our choice, to say we're going to try to go deeper than wider, and we're going to grow leadership within, and that's the second point. So in any ministry, there's a culture, and you can judge whether it's good or bad, but it's there. And let's just assume it's healthy. How are you going to ensure that that healthy culture continues? Well, what I've observed is if you import leadership from without, a lot of times it changes the culture, and those who've gathered around that culture begin to flake off or go other places, and then there's a new crop that comes in that surrounds the culture of the new leadership, whatever that is. And so we were like, we feel like we have a responsibility to raise up leadership. We don't just want to trust the seminaries and Beeson Divinity School and other places to raise up leadership and just grab from them. We want to be responsible as far as we can with that. So we want to go more deep than wide, and we want to ask God that He would raise up the future leaders of this campus ministry, the future leaders of the church plant that eventually came because of the campus ministry, and we want to see God raise up leaders from within as far as possible. And we were able to see that happen. And so we felt like that was our responsibility as well, not only to see the Lord kind of prosper the gospel and people come to Him, but also be responsible for establishing them in the faith and giving them a vision about God's work in the world and all the rest of that. And so when we left at the end of 2011, this was the team we left. So I'm going to skip back to, where's that first team? I'm going to skip back to, that's the team that went. All Americans, and over the years they each returned to the U.S. for various reasons. Here's me and my wife. We were the last ones standing. We won the missionary survivor game there, and so when we eventually left, this is the Aussie team that was there, and again, it was the honor and privilege of my life just to even be involved in that. I don't have the skills or the knowledge or the influence to be able to do this. This was just a work of the Lord. But, man, involved in this picture are those who came to know the Lord in our university ministry, who are now leading the university ministry and pastors of the church. And so to go deeper than wider, it takes longer, and it takes a lot of patience, and it takes a lot of years. But the fruit of that, over time, will be greater, I believe, than if you choose to go wider than deep. And so, again, that was just something we committed to, and we're able to see God do. And finally, get out of the way, but over a long period of time. And so, overseas and in our training, it was always encouraged, raise up the local leadership. But what I observed was it was done way too fast. And you didn't give that time for maturation, just time to mature under leadership. And so we tried to get out of the way, but over a period of time. So this is how we do it. So going back to this picture, this gentleman on the right, his name's Pete Bradbury. That's his wife, Carly. He began to come to our church, and he was working for Telstra, the AT&T of Australia. But when I followed him up from his initial time and learned that he was a believer, he understood the gospel, I began to sense after a few lunches with him that, there were hints and clues that he really was open to kind of a vocational ministry. And so I began to just spend time with him and place him in little positions so that I could coach, encourage, help, observe. And so one time we led a community group together, like a small group, and I would do part and I'd give him some, and then I'd give him feedback. And just over those years I thought, man, there are some gifts and talents here. Let me raise that to another level. And just this happened across the board with a number of people. And so if you're paying attention going, okay, I want to be responsible for raising up leadership, then I want to begin to give the ministry away, but in appropriate ways and appropriate times. I don't want it to go too fast. I want to be able to observe and give feedback. And over the time we were. And so we tried to prepare the leadership ahead of time. After 8 years there, I saw that my role was needed less and less, that the Aussies were doing more than more. And of course, their desire was that we would stay around. We had a great relationship, but it's always tough to do ministry when the ex-pastor's in the room, you know? And so I knew that eventually for them to really own it, I had to get out of the way. So the last 4 years, I told the elders and deacons at the church, this will be our last time here, and you need to prepare for that. And then in the last year, we let the church know. And so it wasn't a 2-week notice, and we're out. We prepared them over years. And I think that was really healthy. We got good counsel on that. But again, back to the point of wanting to give away the ministry and raise up other leaders, but over time and giving time for maturation and affirmation and encouragement and training and all the other things that are necessary there. And so I'll stop there. Those are just some of the things that I needed to grow in and learn. Hopefully there's some application to you guys. I'd welcome your questions about Australia, ministry there, life there, any questions that you guys might have. But thanks for just letting me tell you the story about how honored I was to be able to serve in Australia for all those years.
Well, I'll start us off with our first question, and then I will turn the mic over to you guys if you guys have questions. My question to you would be, how did your experience in education at Beeson help prepare you for serving cross-culturally? And what would you say that you have brought back with you to the States as well?
Yeah. In this picture, Beeson grad, right here. And so I knew these gentlemen before, but you talk about that team. Well, in many ways, it was gathered right here from Beeson. And we would obviously take all the classes together, had Dr. Bray for all of those in terms of the history and other things. But we would take these classes together and talk about them. And so I would say Beeson, in many ways, helped form a major part of our team. And it came from the relationships that I had previous, but were kind of solidified here through many hours of class taking and discussions and just relationships and things like that. And so I would say at least that way helped form this team that went to Australia. So.
Well, first off, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for sharing just your testimony and just your story of this wonderful ministry you started down in Australia. When you first step onto that campus, you mentioned talking about Cromwell College. Mm-hmm. You go into that room, how do you balance, that first interaction where you say, hey, I'm David, I'm from America, and I just want to get to know you guys, with your final motivation of, I want to reach the gospel to you guys? How do you handle that tension? Because there's always that tension. It's like, why is this guy in this group?
Yeah,
absolutely. Sort of thing. So I don't know if that makes sense, but.
No, it does. And there was no way around that. It was odd that a 30-year-old was around a bunch of 18 and 19-year-olds, and there was no way. I didn't want to hide the fact that I was there as a Christian minister. I think that would be not genuine, and in the end would hurt me more than anything else. And so that's where I think it took months, because most people gravitated away from me for a long time until they saw, okay, he's around, he's coming to our intramural rugby games, he's serving at our pancake breakfasts, and just, as I said, our strategy was to show up and to be there and to work through those initial, distances over time where people saw, okay, he likes who we are, he wants to be around, and it over time broke the ice. But I was pretty upfront with it at the beginning if they said, who are you and why are you here? The principal of the college had given me permission to be in and around, and he was a believer, so that was huge. So I could say, oh, the principal just allows me to be around. I'm here just to meet guys and also to talk about the Christian faith. And so, of course, it wasn't attractive to most of the college students, but over time, when issues came up in their life, more often than not, they would call me up, and that's how a lot of things started there. Does that make sense?
Makes perfect sense.
Yeah, yeah. Yes, sir.
David, I'm not clear from what you were saying. The group that you left behind,
Yes.
is that a church?
I'm sorry, I didn't have time to share that.
And is it connected with the Presbyterian church there? Or
Right.
get into that?
Okay, yeah. So, over 4 years with the university ministry, the students began to graduate, but there were some good churches in Brisbane, but not many. And we began to see them flounder a bit and wilt, and that really burdened us. And so we thought, well, Brisbane's not saturated with the gospel, and so nor good churches, so we'll, begin a church. And so I transitioned to plant the church from the campus. And so we investigated joining in with the Presbyterian Church of Australia and some other ones, but the red tape of it all was so great that it was almost prohibitive. And so what we sought to do was what we called have fraternal relationship with them. That is expressing to them, we're on the same team, we're together, but we eventually aligned with a fellowship of evangelical churches, which is a broad umbrella type association. They weren't a denomination, but they were an association. And so it was just cleaner that way and less complicated. And I think there was always a little suspicion, for whatever reason, that, and Americans want to join in the Presbyterian Church of Australia. I don't know why, but anyway, that's kind of how it came to be. But we did have good relationship with a number of churches there, but it just was almost too complicated to join in there, if that makes sense. I don't know. Right, under the umbrella of the Fellowship of Evangelical Churches of Australia, yes. So.
Yeah, had you gone through ordination before going to Australia?
I did, yes. So traveled through that with the PCA, and in order, obviously, to even do the church plant, you had to be ordained, and so yeah, traveled through that right before we left. I got held up actually for 6 months because they weren't happy with my view on some of the Holy Spirit matters, and that was a helpful thing. I mean, I look back and I'm thankful for that process of men looking in, asking questions, going, I think you need to sharpen this here, and holding me off. At the time, it wasn't comfortable because all my friends got ordained, but for me, it was a very good time, a good humbling time, and a good learning time. So yeah, that process was good, but done and dusted before I left. So yeah. Yes, sir.
David, can you compare and contrast your ministry and starting this church in Helena with your effort in Brisbane?
Again, I think the Lord really had to humble me for a number of months and work through a lot of self-righteousness in me and in returning. I was frustrated greatly that my gospel conversations went from more than I could handle to I could hardly find. It seemed like everyone that I met had some sort of Christian story, whether they were believers or not, but that was highly frustrating to me, and I had to learn what it is to reach the heart of a religious Southerner again, because I was used to a secular atheist type mindset, and two totally, obviously, different matters, and that I need to have equal compassion and yearning, instead of being turned off by the religiosity of the South, actually have compassion on that. And so in that way, it was similar, that I had to have a similar mindset, but it's been a totally different approach. And so I don't know if that makes sense, but where the Lord had me, as I said before, was I had to engage here like I engaged there. I couldn't assume on this culture that I came from and that I thought I knew anymore. I needed to relearn it. And so I've been trying to do that. I'm still frustrated at my lack of gospel conversations. Some of that's on me, but I yearn for them. And if you've lived in a culture that is much more secular, you'd find that you're able to have a lot of gospel conversations, at least, maybe not the whole gospel, but on the periphery and spiritual conversation. So, yeah. All right.